The Philosopher's Stone by Christoph Martin Wieland, 1789. In the days when Cornwall still had its own princes, a young king by the name of Mark ruled over this small peninsula of Great Britain. He was the grandson of that same King Mark who had become famous through his wife, the beautiful Isolde, also called Iseult the Blonde, and her love affair with the noble and unfortunate Tristan of Leonoi. The young King Mark was very much like his grandfather. He was arrogant without ambition, sensuous without taste, and greedy without knowing how to be economical. As soon as he inherited the throne, which was at a very young age, he began to give in to his passions and moods, and to live in a style that would have ruined a country much larger and richer than his own. When his income was no longer sufficient for his expenses, he burdened his subjects with new taxes, and when they no longer had anything to give, he made money off them by selling them to his neighbors. While all of this was happening, King Mark continued to maintain a splendid court and managed everything as though he had found an inexhaustible supply of gold. To be sure, he had not found such a supply, but he was at least making a great effort to look for one. And as soon as it became known that he was looking for gold, all kinds of strange people appeared at his court who were anxious to help him locate the gold. Treasure seekers, necromancers, alchemists, and swindlers who called themselves disciples of the great Hermes came from all over the world and were welcomed with open arms at the court. Indeed, aside from all the vices that poor Mark had, he was also the most gullible man in the world, so that the first tramp who came along and boasted that he had secret powers could get anything out of him that he wanted. Therefore, his court was swarming with such rabble. One man pretended he had a natural gift that enabled him to smell where treasures had been buried. Another knew how to discover them with the help of a divining rod. There was yet a third man who assured the king that everything was futile unless one possessed the secret of hypnotizing ghosts who came in the form of wise men, or as figures who wore terrible masks, or of turning them into servants. And he let it be known in a modest way that he possessed the secret. There were others who regarded magic with disdain. Everything they did was natural. They rejected talismans, magic spells, circles, figures, and whatever else belonged to the domain as plain deception and delusion. Whatever the others pretended to achieve through supernatural powers, these achieved, if one believed in them, through mere natural forces. Whoever had penetrated the innermost holy essence of nature, so they said, whoever had become familiar with the true elements of things, their affinities, sympathies, and antipathies in nature's secret workshop, whoever knew how to unite the spirit of nature that assumed all different forms with the salt of nature that dissolved everything and could keep this protean force under control with the help of the astral fire that penetrated everything and could compel it to appear in its own original form. This man was a true sage. He alone deserved to be called an adept. There was nothing he could not do, for he commanded nature, which could bring about anything. He could transform inferior minerals into superior ones. He possessed the means to cure any kind of sickness. He could recall the dead to life if he and the gods wanted to do this, and it was in his power to live as long as he desired, until he felt it more convenient to move to another world. All of this appealed very much to King Mark's taste, but since he could not decide which one of his miracle workers he should keep and could not bear to send the others away, he kept them all and tried them out one after the other. The day was spent with empirics, the night with exercising and digging for treasures. And when the swindlers realized that he did not like to have one person monopolize everything, they soon learned, to his great joy, to tolerate one another as if everything could fit together into one huge bag. Several years went by like this without King Mark moving closer to the object of his desires. He had allowed half of his small kingdom to be dug up, but no treasure was found. And his hope to transform the copper and tin of his mines into gold went up the chimney, along with the gold that his had long since taken from the mines. If such disasters had happened to anyone else but Mark, they would have caused that person to open his eyes. But the king's eyes gradually became more blurred. He became now obsessed with finding the philosopher's stone, the hope that he might finally obtain this protean power, which assumed all kinds of forms, increased in exact proportion to the number of losses he suffered. He believed that he had still not found the right man yet, but in the same moment that he would banish 10 swindlers from his presence, he would open his arms to the very next one who arrived at his court. Finally, an Egyptian adept from the secret school of the great Hermes announced his presence at King Mark's court. He called himself Misfragmutosiris and had a beard that hung down to his belt dot. In addition, he wore a cap in the form of a pyramid that had a golden sphinx attached to its top, long cloak stitched with hieroglyphs, and a belt made of gilded tin in which the 12 signs of the zodiac were engraved. King Mark considered himself to be the luckiest man on earth to have such a wise man with so promising an appearance at his court. And even though the Egyptian was quite reserved, they soon became good friends. Everything about him, his stature, clothes, language, manners, and the way he conducted himself, indicated that he was an extraordinary man. He always dined alone and never ate what other people did. He had some large snakes and a stuffed crocodile in his room. He treated them with great respect, and it seemed that he held secret conversations with them from time to time. He talked about the most marvelous things and enigmatic things with openness and indifference, as if these things were the most common and familiar in the world. However, he rarely answered questions, and if he did, then he did so in a way that left one with the feeling that there was more to ask, even though the questioner now knew just as little as he knew before. He talked about people who had lived many centuries ago as if he had known them very well. At the very least, one had to conclude from his talk that he had been a contemporary of King Amasis, even though he clearly declared this to be true. What made him most credible in Mark's eyes was the fact that he had a great deal of gold and a bunch of rare items with him, and he talked about huge sums of money as if they were trifles. All these circumstances intensified curiosity of the gullible King Mark to such a degree that he could not stand it any longer. And no matter how the king's guest had resisted everything, enough was enough, and the wise Misfragmutosiris finally let himself be moved by the king's entreaties. Either that, or his heart no longer allowed him to be ungrateful in view of the honors and the gifts that the king heaped upon him. Therefore, he finally revealed the entire secret of his identity to King Mark, but of course he did not do this until he had led the king through various kinds of graduated initiations demanded by the order of Hermes. The gods, Misfragmutosiris said, "Give their precious gifts to whomever they please. I was just like all the other men, still young, but did know a little about the mysteries of Egyptian philosophy, and my curiosity drove me to penetrate into the interior of the Great Pyramid at Memphis, whose age is a secret even to the Egyptians. There was a certain hieroglyphical inscription over the entrance to the first hall, which I had already discovered and written down, and after I took a great deal of trouble to guess its meaning, I surmised that this pyramid was the tomb of the great Hermes. I decided within the hour I would dare to enter the place, which certainly no living mortal had ever visited before. Even today, my audacity would be difficult for me to grasp if I were not convinced that this idea, which my own mind was not capable of producing, had been engendered in me by some higher power. In short, I climbed into the pyramid about midnight without any light, and completely placing myself in the hands of whatever propelled me to undertake such a bold adventure. I went down a gentle slope for some time, and without noticing it, I began climbing upward again when I suddenly caught sight of a bright light that hovered in front of me like a ball of pure, solid fire. Here, Miss Fragmutosiris paused for a moment, giving King Mark the opportunity to ask, and you had the courage to follow the light. He was sitting across from him in the position of a transfixed listener, his body slanted forward, his feet stretched backward, both hands leaning on his knees, fearful that he might lose a single word of the story. Indeed, he held his breath and kept his eyes wide open as he listened. I followed the light, the Egyptian continued, and proceeded through a hallway that became low and narrow, until I came to a four-cornered room with walls polished of marble, and it had a door that led me to another hallway. After walking about 50 feet, I came to two paths. One seemed to lead up a steep incline. The other, on my left, went straight ahead. I followed the ball of light straight in front of me until I came to the edge of a deep well. Owing to the extreme brightness of the light, I became aware of a number of short iron rungs, about 2 feet apart, that stuck out on the wall from top to bottom. They formed a dangerous kind of ladder, which one could use in an emergency to climb down into the well. Without thinking for too long, I began to undertake the dizzy descent, when suddenly the ball of light disappeared and left me in terrifying darkness. I don't understand why my fright didn't cause me to fall into the abyss at this horrible moment. No matter, I collected myself and took even greater care as I continued to climb down. I held one hand on a rung over my head, while I searched below for the next on with my other hand and feet. Eventually, there were no more rung, and I heard water rustling beneath me. At the same time, however, I became aware of an opening on the side that I had been climbing down, and from it came a faint glow. I jumped into this opening and landed on a steep path that led into an enormous cave of glimmering granite, which illuminated by a huge carbuncle that was hanging from the middle of the arched ceiling. Imagine my astonishment as I found myself suddenly on the edge of a rippling stream that poured out of an opening over ragged rocks in this cave made a terrible noise. It took me just a moment to think of what I had to do. I had already gone too far to turn back, and a secret spirit seemed to whisper to me that all these obstacles had been placed before me in order to test my courage. So I took off all my clothes, tied them up in a bundle on top of my head, and plunged into the dark stream and propelled through a dark vault. Gradually, I noticed that the water under me had become shallow. Soon, the water disappeared altogether, and left me sitting on some mossy ground in a large cave. Now I felt an extraordinary heat, which dried me so quickly that I could immediately get dressed again to see where a narrow opening would lead me. There was a bright light coming from it, and as I approached the opening, I heard a sizzling and a crackling that appeared to come from a blazing fire. I crept into the opening, which eventually widened, and I found myself at the entrance of a wide arched room where I encountered another obstacle, more horrifying than the previous ones. In front of me, I saw an abyss of fire that practically filled the entire room. Its flames seethed and flared up as if out of a lake of fire over granite banks that surrounded it, and they seemed to quiver at my feet. Instead of bridge, there was a kind of plank made of 4 narrow copper sheets bound together, which reached from one bank to the other. However, the plank was barely a foot wide. I must honestly confess that despite the great heat of this terrible place, I felt ice-cold chills running up and down my spine. But what else could I do but forge ahead on this adventure too, without having much time to think about possibilities? How I made it over to the other side, I don't know myself, but I did make it over, and before I had time to know what was happening, I felt caught up in a whirlwind and propelled indescribable rapidity through the most horrifying darkness. I lost consciousness, but soon regained my senses when I felt myself being thrown roughly against a door, which immediately sprang open, and I found myself standing in a splendidly illuminated hall. Its arched ceiling was painted in azure like the sky, and was filled with an infinite number of carbuncles and constellations. The ceiling was supported by rows of massive gold pillars, on which countless hieroglyphs, made of multicolored precious stone, were glistening. I stood there for some minutes, completely dazed and delighted by the splendor. "That I can believe," exclaimed King Mark, "especially after everything that you had gone through. I would have liked to be in your place when I collected myself again," Miss Fragmutosiris continued, without paying any attention to King's lively interest. "I noticed a huge door made of ebony with a colossal sphinx on each side, carved from ivory and marvelously beautiful. However, to my great regret, they were so close to the door and so near to one another that it seemed completely impossible to open the door and to satisfy the longing that had brought about my involvement in such a dangerous adventure. While I now stood in front of the forbidden door, I began in vain to think of some means to overcome this difficulty. I looked at the top of the door and caught sight of diamond characters that formed the name of Hermes Trismegistus in holy script that I knew. I read the name in a loud voice, and no sooner had I done this than the door opened by itself. The 2 sphinxes came alive, looked at me with sparkling eyes, and retreated far enough to allow me to go between them. As soon as I passed the threshold of the ebony door, it closed of itself as though moved by an invisible spirit, and I found myself in a round dome of black jasper, whose terrible darkness was brightened only at 10-second intervals by a streak of lightning that suddenly flashed around smooth black walls and disappeared as soon as it has appeared. As this majestic and mysterious light kept flickering, I caught sight of a large, glorious bed in the middle of the dome, so richly ornamented that it was indescribable. There seemed to be a tall, venerable old man with a bald head and snow-white beard lying on top of the bed in a soft slumber, with his hands folded on top of his chest. 2 dragons were stationed at his head, and they had such strange and horrifying forms that I believe I can still see them standing before me, though many centuries have gone by. They had flat heads with long drooping ears, round glassy eyes, which seemed to pop out of their sockets, backs like crocodiles, extremely long and thick, swan-like necks, and enormous leather wings like those of bats. The front parts of their bodies were protected by stiff, glittering scales and armed with the feet of eagles, and rear parts ended in thick tails that were wrapped around themselves 7 times. I soon realized that the flashes of lightning that illuminated the room for a moment every 10 seconds came from the nostrils of these dragons, and that this was their way of breathing Dot. Despite the fact that these atrocious monsters looked horrifying, they did not seem to mean me ill, but rather allowed me to observe the majestic sage as long as I wanted. He was sleeping the long slumber of death there while the light kept flashing. Soon I noticed a thick scroll of Egyptian paper that lay at the feet of the sage and appeared to be covered with hieroglyphs, figures. As soon as I saw this scroll, I was overcome by an incredible longing to possess it, for I was quite sure that it contained the hidden secrets of the great Hermes. I stretched out my hand 10 times, and I quickly pulled it back 10 times, out of fear. Finally, my longing got the better of me, and my hand touched the holy treasure, which was more valuable in my eyes than all the treasure above and below the earth. Suddenly, a stroke of lightning came out the mouth of one of the dragons, knocked me to the ground, and paralyzed all my limbs, so that I was unable to stand. At the same time, a small winged snake with a crown on its head, and which cast off the brightest rays of the sun, flew down from the top of the dome and breathed on me. I felt the power of its breath penetrated all my nerves like a sharp spiritual flame, so that I was numb for some moments. However, when I pulled myself together, I saw a young boy in front of me, sitting on a lotus leaf, and as he pressed the index finger of his right hand to his mouth, he used his left hand to offer me the scroll that I had seen lying at the feet of the sleeping sage. I recognized the God of holy silence and prostrated myself at his feet. But he disappeared, and now I first became aware that I was not in the Great Pyramid of Memphis, but in my own bed. I had no idea how everything happened. Wonderful! Upon my honor, most strange, King Mark exclaimed, with all the astonishment and surprise one would accord a thoroughly believable story. That's how it seemed to me, responded Miss Phragmutosiris, and I certainly would have talked myself into believing that I had merely dreamed all these marvelous things, but I held the mysterious scroll in my hand, and this convinced me that everything I had experienced had been real. I regarded it now with indescribable delight. I tasted and smelled it on all sides, and I could hardly believe my own senses that such an insignificant person as I was the owner of a treasure that a king would give his crown for. The paper was made of the most beautiful color, the hieroglyphs were painted, and the figures were made of thinly stamped gold. "That must be a beautiful book," King Mark said. "I'd give anything to be able to hold it in my hand for a minute. Do you think I could? Gladly, if I still had it in my possession." "What? You don't have it any more?" Mark cried out in a plaintive tone. "It was in possession for 7 days only." On the 8th, the young boy on the lotus leaf reappeared, took the scroll out of my hand, and disappeared with it forever. But these 7 days were sufficient for me to master 7 secrets, the least of which is worth an inestimable fortune in my eyes. Over 1,000 years have passed since that remarkable night. Over 1,000 years? Interrupted King Mark. Is that possible? Over 1,000 years? Everything is possible, answered the 1,000-year-old disciple of the great Hermes in usual dispassionate manner. This due to the power of the 7th secret. Ever since I learned to possess it, the entire earth has been my fatherland, and I have seen kingdoms and peoples fall around me like leaves from the trees. I live here and there, sometimes in this part of the world, and sometimes in another part. I can speak every human language there is, know about all the affairs of people, and I have nothing to lose or to gain in anything. I don't desire to rule over anyone, and I am nobody's subject. But when I encounter a good king, which is seldom the case, I enjoy increasing his capacity to do good deeds. King Mark assured him that he wished and hoped to be one of those good kings. At any rate, he had always enjoyed doing good deeds, and it was merely to do an infinite amount of good deeds that he had constantly wished to obtain the Philosopher's Stone. Mist Fragmutosiris let him know that they could discuss this matter. He seemed to regard it as a trifle, but he did not want to explain himself fully. Meanwhile, his queen Mabille contributed a great deal to making the festivities at court more lively and more glittering. For a long time, King Mark, who loved change, had given his wife some reason to feel neglected, and the jealousy with which she felt obliged to show him her affection had become so burdensome for him that he sometimes uttered the wish that she, without tarnishing her virtue, would think of some other means to drive away her boredom than to take delight in spoiling his small pleasures. This why he seemed either not to notice, or, as some courtiers believed, was secretly very glad to see that a handsome young knight by the name of Floribel of Nicomedes, who had recently appeared at his court, began wooing the queen's favor in a most glaring way and was making considerable progress. In fact, everything had evolved to the point that Mabille herself could no longer deny her feelings for the handsome Floribel. And since she was strongly resolved to offer brave resistance, the affairs of her heart took up all her time, so that she did not have any left to disturb the king in his affairs. No matter how much King Mark liked to amuse himself at parties, he never for 1 second lost sight of his major objective and passion. Several months had already gone by since Mark begun treating the heir of the great Trismegistus like a monarch at his court, and he believed that he could now justifiably demand something from Miss Fragmutosiris as a friend. To be sure, Miss Fragmutosiris had constantly declared that he was against rewards and large gifts, but no friend, he used to say, can refuse to accept from another friend's little gifts that are only worth something because of the friendship of which they are symbolic. However, since the terms little and large are relative, and since our adept spoke about things commonly estimated to have a large value as if there were insignificant, the small gifts that he graciously began to accept little by little from his friend Mark soon exhausted the treasury of the poor king, and it was high time to replenish it by way of new and lucrative sources. The Egyptian seemed to feel the necessity of this himself, and upon the first allusion that the king had made to the 7 secrets, Miss Fragmutosiris did not hesitate to confess to him that the first and least of the secrets was the art of preparing the philosopher's stone. Mark assured him that he would be very satisfied just to learn the least of the secrets, and the adept took pleasure in revealing to him a secret in which, to be sure, he did not place great stock, but which nevertheless had to remain hidden forever to prevent it from being misused by the profane, as he wisely said. The true hermetical philosopher's stone, he said, can only be drawn from the finest precious stones, diamonds, emeralds, rubies, sapphires, and opals. The preparation of the stone, through a mixture of a large portion of red mercury, sulfide, and some drops of oil drawn from a condensed ray of the sun, is less costly or complicated than troublesome, and demands almost nothing but an unusual degree of attention and patience. And this is the most reason why it would not be worth the trouble to conduct a small experiment. The result of the operation, which in my hands not take longer than 3 times 7 days, is a kind of crimson substance, which is very heavy and can be scraped into a fine powder, of which a pinch half the size of a barley seed is sufficient to transform 2 pounds of lead into just as much gold. And this, what one generally calls the philosopher's stone. King Mark ardently yearned to have a few pounds of glorious product at his disposal as soon as possible. Therefore, he asked somewhat fearfully whether a very large quantity of precious stones would be necessary to gain a pound of this philosopher's stone. "Oh," said Miss Phragmutocercis, "I realize where the problem may lies. We shall not have a lack for precious stones, for I also possess the secret to make the finest and purest precious stones. I must confess, however, that this operation is slow. It demands just as many months as the philosopher's stone does days, but—" "No," Mark interrupted him. "I cannot wait that long. I'd rather give up my crowns and all the rest of my jewelry on it. 21 months is an eternity. Once we have the stone of stones, then we shall have plenty of all the rest. You can get anything you want with my gold, and in any event, I certainly won't hold it against you if you want to make precious stones at your leisure." "As you wish," said that adept with 200 pounds of diamonds and double the amount of rubies, emeralds and other precious gems, will be able to obtain a stone 12,000 grams, and will be able to do something with that. It would take me 100 years before I could get as much." "It's a trifle," said King Mark. "I'll bet there are more stones on my mere house crown than you demand. But when we really begin the work, it must be worth the trouble. Just let me take care of everything. We must obtain a stone weighing 24,000 grams, or my name is not King Mark." "The fortunate thing is," said the adept, "that I already have a supply of sun oil, which is the most precious of all the ingredients, takes 21 years to prepare. I've always taken care to carry some vials of this oil with me. Aside from the fact that it is the major component in preparing the stone, it's also the material from which the hermetic oil of immortality is prepared through a process that requires 3 times 21 years. In the near future, I'll reveal to you as much about it, its miraculous powers, as I'm allowed to." King Mark was beside himself with joy to possess a friend who had such revelations to make, and he hurried as fast as he could to help arrange all the necessary things for the great work. There were plenty of ovens and all sorts of chemical equipment at his court, but where experiments had been conducted for many years. But Miss Phragmutocercis declared that, with an exception of a small stove, which he had built in a small cabinet in his room, and a sack of coal, he did not need anything, since he had everything with him that was necessary for the operation. When all the preparations were completed, he consulted the stars instead of date for the beginning of the secret experiment at the first hour after midnight. Anticipation of this, he made the king an initiate of the Hermetic mystery so that Mark would be capable of witnessing all the work appertaining to the great experiment. The only one thing that he not witness was the ultimate mystery, whereby the spirit of the 3 times great Hermes had to appear to endorse the experiment. Only adepts of the highest degree were able to withstand his presence, and Miss Fragmutosiris let the king know that he himself was the only living mortal who could boast this ability, and consequently he was the invisible high priest of the entire Hermetic order. Finally, when the long-awaited midnight approached, King Mark with his own hands gave the adept a golden chest. It was filled with diamonds, emeralds, ruby sapphires, and oriental opals that he had removed from the 2 or 3 crowns inherited from his ancestors. On this occasion, he was allowed into the secret cabinet for the first time. Until this moment, no living mortal, with the exception of the adept, had been allowed to set foot in it. Was decorated all around pictures of Egyptian gods and hieroglyphs, and was illuminated only by a single lamp which hung from the ceiling. In the middle was a small round stove made of black marble in the form of an altar, upon which the great work was to be performed. Miss Fragmutosiris, dressed in the garments of an Egyptian high priest, began the ceremony by fumigating the king with a pleasant incense that made him feel numb. Then the adept made a large hermetic magic circle around the altar, and within it a smaller circle, which marked with 7 hieroglyphic figures, just as he had marked the outer one with 9. He commanded the king to stand in the outer circle, but he himself entered the inner circle in front of the altar, where he threw a few kernels of incense into a pan and muttered some words that the king could not understand. As soon as the smoke began to rise, a long-eared boy sitting on a lotus leaf appeared above the altar, with the index finger of his right hand pressed to his mouth and with his left hand carrying a burning torch. Mark became pale as a ghost from the boy appeared and could barely keep his feet. But the adept approached the boy's ear, what does mouth, and the whispered something to him, whereupon the boy answered in the affirmative with a nod of his head and disappeared. Miss Fragmutosiris told the king to keep his courage up, gave him a spoonful of an elixir, a powerful dose to strengthen his life spirit, and recommended that he reappear at 7 in the morning. In the meantime, the king was to go and rest, while he himself would keep watch in order to wait for the appearance of great Hermes, which had been announced to him, and to complete the secret mysteries with which the great experiment had to begin if they wanted to be guaranteed that everything would turn out successfully. King Mark went to his own room full of trust and hope, and since what the adept had given him was a sleeping potion, he had a long and uninterrupted sleep, and did not wake until 2 hours after the time he was supposed to reappear in Miss Fragmutosiris's chamber. When he finally arose, he threw on his clothes and rushed to the secret cabinet, where he found everything just as he had left it. However, the wise Miss Fragmutosiris and the golden chest with the precious stones had vanished. There are no words that can describe the king's dismay when he saw how cruelly his sanguine hopes and his boundless trust in the chief of the Hermetic order had been betrayed. After he overcame the numbness of his astonishment, he began to berate himself, and this was followed by an outburst of curses and furious threats against the swindler, who was probably laughing at Mark's gullibility and some safe refuge. Just as the king was about to descend to his large hall, and order all his knights and servants to pursue the fugitive, a marvelously handsome young man dressed in bright, glittering garments, with a golden crown on his head and a lily in his hand, stood all at once before him and spoke. "I'm aware of the catastrophe that has upset your life," he said, "and I have brought you compensation. You've been searching for the Philosopher's Stone. Well, take this stone dot, rub it back and forth 3 times on your forehead, and your chest and your wish shall be fulfilled." After speaking these words, the young man placed a crimson stone in his hand, disappeared. King Mark's mood swung from dismay to ecstasy. He regarded the stone which he had received in such a miraculous and unexpected way, and inspected it from all sides. Although he did not grasp how his wish would be fulfilled in what connection there was between rubbing his forehead and chest with the stone, he was well accustomed to believing in and doing things that he did not comprehend at all. Indeed, it was impossible for him to doubt or resist the command of this spirit. Consequently, he rubbed the magical stone back and forth 3 times on his forehead and chest, and just as he finished, he stood there transformed into a donkey. While all this was happening to the king, a terrifying clamor broke out in the other wing of the castle. The handsome young knight Floribel, who, we cannot deny this, was under suspicion of having spent the night in the bedroom of the queen, and had disappeared this morning with the better part of the queen's jewels. Mabille, the first person at court to discover this, was just about to begin ripping her beautiful hair out of her head because of the shame and anger she felt when the lady of indescribable beauty, in a rose-colored dress with a crown of roses on her head, stood before her and said, "I know what's bothering you, beautiful queen. I've come to help you. Take this rose and place it on your breast. Then you'll become happier than you've ever been before." With these words, the lady handed her a rose from a crown and vanished. Since the queen did not have anything better in mind, she complied with the lady's command. She stuck the rose on her bosom and found herself instantaneously transformed into a rose-colored goat and transported to a wild and desolate place. When the chambermaids entered her room at the usual hour that morning and did not find the queen or jewels or even the handsome Floribel, there's me and the noise they produced, or more awful than one can imagine. It was completely clear that she had let herself be abducted by the young knight, and the servants went to report this to the king. But their honor and confusion became even greater when they were also unable to find the king and his new favorite, the man with the big white beard. They could not picture King Mark letting himself be abducted by an old man with a gray beard. Consequently, they stopped trying to imagine what had happened, even though nothing else was talked about in Cornwall during the next week. The knights and their pages took to their horses and searched for the king and the queen 4 long months in all corners of Great Britain. But the search was in vain. They returned home knowing just as little as when they had left. The only thing that consoled the people was the conviction that it would be easy for them to find another king if they did not want to have a wiser one than King Mark. The royal donkey, meanwhile, in order not to be discovered, had carefully made his way out of the castle into the open. In a sullen mood, his ears drooping, He had already trotted for some hours through the woods and fields when he encountered a young peasant woman and a gorge, carrying a large sack over her shoulders. Her fine figure, fresh complexion, and beautiful blonde hair kindled in him a desire that was better suited for his previous condition than his present one. He stood still in order to stare at the young woman who has lost her breath from walking and was so exhausted that she could not go any farther. The sympathy of that she seemed to have aroused in the animal, who was from all appearance without an owner, aroused her attention. She approached him and began stroking him with her soft white hands. Since he kept a very still and bared his teeth in order to show that it was pleased him to be petted by such a soft hand, stretched his ears as far as they could go, she suddenly had the desire to employ him and her service, and swung herself onto his back. The donkey put up with the unaccustomed work complacently, and the young peasant had no idea of his secret reasons for carrying her. With such pleasure he seemed proud of the charming burden, and trotted briskly from that spot with her on his back, like one of the best mules from Andalusia. Although she had nothing which she could direct him, other than his short mane, he seemed to understand the movements of her hands, and even the meanings of her words. Thus he carried her through a series of byways that she indicated to him, and by nightfall they arrived in a wild region on the seacoast, which was enclosed by cliffs and woods, and was only partially open to the neighboring sea. They came to a halt in front of a cave surrounded by boulders and wild bushes, where the young peasant woman called out in a ringing voice, "It's me, Casilda," 2 or 3 times. A fine, strapping man of about 30 or 40, dressed in a sailor suit, came out of the cave, and rejoicing greatly over her arrival, he helped her off the animal, embracing her, and he exclaimed, "Thank heaven that you're here, dear Casilsa. I was so worried that something might have happened to you. You should say thank you to this good donkey." The peasant woman replied laughingly without him, "You would probably not have seen me so soon again, if at all. As a reward, then I'll let him rest and eat as much grass and thistles as he can find in this barren place." The man said, "I'm eternally in his debt for having delivered you, and as I see the dear sack safe and sound to my arms." The royal donkey was greatly startled to hear a voice that was extremely familiar to him. He regarded the 2 people whom he followed into the cave without them noticing it. By the light of a lamp that hung down from the rocks, it seemed to him that he recognized the features of the sailor and the young peasant woman. He took a closer look at the sailor's face, and the similarity appeared to become greater as he approached a kind of stone table that stuck out from the rock walls. His eyes got the sight of a long white beard, and suddenly it dawned dreadfully on his dumb skull who the man was. "Ha ha ha!" the young person laughed. "There's the hermetical beard." "I truly don't know," the man said in the same tone, "why I didn't throw the beard into a hedge along the way. It served its purpose, and we'll hardly need it again." "You can be sure of that," the young woman replied, that she tapped the sack. "Just take a look and tell me if I'm not worthy enough to be the mistress of a contemporary king of Amasis." "You certainly are," cried the wise Miss Fragmutosiris. "You're even worthy of the 3 times great Hermes himself if you want." But he continued, "What have you done with the glittering garments that made you look like a handsome knight, Casilda?" "As you can see, I traded them to the first pretty peasant girl I met, as she was going to the market in town. We'll get over the loss, the head priests of the Hermetic Order said, as he examined the precious contents of the sack. But just so you don't boast too much about all your talents, my girl, take a look at all this and tell me whether all my adventures in the Great Pyramid of Memphis and the terror I experienced from the lightning of the dragons and the glorious bed of the great Hermes were worth it. Just imagine how His Majesty the poor donkey felt as you watched all the gifts that the rogue had gradually received from him, along with all the precious stones of his crowns and the largest portion of the queen's jewelry being spread out in all the sparkling glory on the stone table. If it were not for the limitless patience, a virtue most characteristic of the species of beasts to which he now belonged, that lent him strength, it would have been impossible for him to prevent the fury that was boiling in his body from exploding in a truly terrible way. Oh, why did I have to be changed into a donkey of all things, he thought. If I were a leopard, a tiger, or a rhinoceros, and show them something, but as I am, there's nothing I can do. They can easily handle a donkey. Such was the way that poor King Mark spoke to himself, and he continued to lie very quietly in his corner, pressed as tightly against the wall as possible, so that he could at least satisfy his curiosity by overhearing the intimate conversation of the two sly scoundrels who had plotted his downfall. After they feasted their eyes on the precious booty, they both felt an urgent need to fill their stomachs, for neither of them had eaten anything the entire day. The adept, who always thought of everything, had supplied himself with an abundant amount of food from the royal kitchen, since everything had stood at his command in the castle, and the food would last for some days. He took some of it out of the sack along with some delicious wine, and while they enjoyed their meal, they did not forget to laugh at the King of Cornwall's gullibility and the weakness of his virtuous wife, and they each recalled 1,000 little incidents. Now I must tell you, dear Gabletone, the beautiful rascal said how I managed to bewilder the virtuous queen, so I could carry out our plan. How you managed it, Casilda. The way you looked in your knightly garments and with all the rest of your talents, what queen in the world wouldn't have been captivated by you? Flatterer. My queen kept struggling about in my snare so much that she almost tore my net apart. Actually, she almost resisted my seductive talents, but her jealousy about the king's coquetry, her boredom, her excited imagination, and her frustrated desires were all in my favor. She was finally overcome, even though she struggled, until the very last moment the party held by the king on the day before we disappeared helped my chances immensely. I increased my zealous foray to win her heart. The dancing and the Greek wines heated up her blood. She abandoned herself to a certain merriment, which made her carefree and trusting of everyone. She did what she had never done before. She made a game out of my passion, and without noticing it. She became the more ensnared to my plot, the less she seemed to see any danger. Finally, the opiate that I had slipped into her wine at just the right moment took its effect. Her senses were overcome by pleasant feeling of exhaustion. Her eyes continued to sparkle, but her knees collapsed. She thought she had become tired from dancing too much and went into her bedroom. As soon as our chambermaids had brought her to bed, if they returned to the dance hall, and I snuck out. Mabille, who was half asleep, was greatly frightened when she saw me standing before her bed. Nevertheless, I realized that I was not entirely unexpected, and that someone else in my place would have been smarter and come later and short, I was able to win over the good lady by using the delicacy that is one of the advantages of my sex I knew to be any less tender or ardent, so that even if the sleeping potion had not been so effective, I would not have been in an embarrassing situation. Nevertheless, the potion soon did work along with my tender caresses, so that upon awakening, I presume that she would probably consider herself more culpable than I could make her feel in this little amber box. But the better part of our jewelry is proof that I did not waste my time by regarding her charms as she slumbered, as the wise Miss Fragmutisirus might have done in my place. Rascal Gabletone said, patting her on the shoulder. Both of us were up to the challenge. You played your role like a professional, and I could not have expected anything less from someone I convinced to leave the theater at Alexandria to help me pursue my plan, which we carried out so successfully. Now, we'll have more than enough to do playing ourselves tomorrow. A fishing boat will take us to Brittany, and from there it will be easy to return to our homeland in the meantime. Beautiful Casilda, let us follow the good example of our donkey, who has fallen asleep in the corner over there. We are safe from pursuit here and need our rest. The royal donkey had only pretended to fall asleep, having been cheated so disgracefully, been an eyewitness to the swindler's success, and worst of all, been transformed from a king into a donkey, and seen his enemy is right before his eyes, but been unable to take revenge, indeed having been, as a donkey, an instrument of their success. All of this choked him so that he could barely breathe. But another scene, which poured the poison of the Furies in all the feelings that were boiling in his body, set him afire so that suddenly that he could no longer control his actions. He jumped up from the ground with a terrifying cry and attacked the happy couple who, not prepared for such a wild behavior from their donkey, received some mighty blows from his hooves before they could defend themselves. But this action eventually turned to the disadvantage of the unfortunate king, as it naturally had to, for the fierce adept soon found a club and gave the long-eared creature a thunderous beating on his head and back, causing it to sink to the ground, half dead finally, only after Casilda, who sympathized with the beast, pleaded with Gabletone, did he finally desist and drag the extremely miserable donkey outside cave. Poor Mark had now been driven to such a misery that death seemed to be the only thing left for him, a former human being and a king to wish for. But the powerful drive of self-preservation manages to struggle against death in every living creature until the last breath is gone. So now the abused donkey crawled as far from the detested cave as he could, and then into the bushes. After a few hours of rest, fresh air, and some good grass that he had found in the woods, he felt fit enough by daybreak to get up on his feet and move along briskly. He walked around in the wilderness the entire day with no other purpose than to keep far from human dwellings, for the worst misfortune that could happen to him would be to fall into the employ of human beings. Fortunately, the wolves and other predatory animals were rare in that region, so he trotted about off the beaten paths the entire day. Satisfied his hunger as best he could, drank out of streams or puddles when he was thirsty, slept in some thickets at night, although his memories did not let him sleep much. The strangest thing about all of this was that he could not drive out of his head the cursed whim that had cost him so much. He still yearned to possess the stone of the wise, even though he was a donkey. During the day he thought of nothing but the stone was the same during the night in his dreams. The beneficent spirit who had decided to cure the king of his foolishness took advantage of the dispositions of Mark's mind and influenced him through a dream. Indeed, if all the wise men on earth had tried a reasoning with him while he was awake, they would not have been successful as his dream, in which he envisaged himself still king of Cornwall, standing irritably in front of his Staunvy after a failed experiment. Suddenly, a handsome young man appeared before him, and he remembered him as the youth who had given him the crimson stone. The spirit spoke to him most seriously. "King Mark, I see that the means with which I sought to cure you from your madness has not had much effect. You deserve to be punished for the way you have kept wishing for the philosopher's stone. I want you to know that you could look for the stone until the end of your days would always be in vain, because no such stone exists. But take this, a lily, and everything that you touch with it will turn into gold." With these words, the youth handed him to Lily, and he vanished. King Mark wondered for a moment whether he should trust the gift, but his curiosity and yearning for gold outweighed all his doubts. He touched the lily to a lump of lead that lay before him, and the lead turned into the finest gold. He repeated the experiment with all the lead and copper with which the room was filled, and he continued to have the same success. Finally, he touched a large pile of coal, and this became a large pile of gold. The rapture of the crazed king was inexpressible. He immediately had 12 new mints built, and the people worked day and night to manufacture coins of all different kinds from the gold he made with his lily. Since things happened very quickly in his dreams, the chambers of his castle were soon filled with more ready money than had ever been circulated on the face of the earth. Now, thought King Mark, the world is mine. He asked himself what his heart desired, and his gold produced it for him, no matter how expensive or extravagant it was, because he controlled an inexhaustible supply of gold. He naturally deluded himself that he could do anything he desired. Thus he wanted all his wishes to be carried out just as rapidly as they originated in him. Whatever he commanded was to occur instantaneously. His subjects did not benefit at all from his immeasurable expenditures, for he did not give them time to create or manufacture any of the materials that were necessary for his pleasures. Moreover, there was a lack of artists in his country, and he could not possibly think of waiting until enough artists were trained. What reason would he have had to support them? Artists and workers from the ends of the earth appeared at its court in all possible products and commodities that one think of were brought to him from Italy, Greece, and Egypt. He had mountains transported, valleys filled, seas dried up, canals made navigable. He built splendid palaces, designed magical gardens that were filled with all the riches of nature, with all the wonders of the arts. And all this was accomplished as if with a flick of the wrist. The most beautiful women, the most perfect virtuous, the most clever inventors of new sensual pleasures. Everything that could arouse and satisfy his passions, lust, and moods stood at his command. He organized tournaments, plays, and banquets unlike anything ever seen before, and often wasted more gold in one day than the richest kings had collected in a year. Still, the enormous amount of gold that King Mark poured into the world brought considerable inconveniences with it. The first was that the foreigners who had flocked to his court from all parts of the world, offering their wares, their heads, hands, or feet, raised their prices as soon as they were informed about his exhaustible supply of gold. First 100, then 1,000, and finally 10,000%. The products of the craftsmen became so expensive that gold of which there was a surplus became cheap, and eventually it could no longer be used as a symbol of the value of things in trade. But before this happened, another consequence of the magical lily, which in the king's hands replaced the stone of the wise, revealed itself was worse than anything else. While his court life was conducted in a bountiful, sumptuous, and wasteful way, which flooded half the world with gold, most of his subjects were starving because they were denied all the opportunities to earn. They stopped all farming and business, for who wanted to do anything when one could have all plays, necessities and luxuries in the harbors of the kingdoms, at all times a much greater quantity and quality of furthermore, all the good-looking young country folk needed only to go to the capital to find 1,000 opportunities and an entirely different fortune through indolence than they could hope to earn at home through work and thrift. As soon as he received a report about the neediness of his people, King Mark, believing that he possessing infallible solution, and forthwith distributed as much gold as he could in all of the cities, towns, and villages of his realm, so that the poorest day labor suddenly found himself richer than any of the nobles of the kingdom had ever been. Mark believed that he had solved the situation, but he had actually caused more problems. For now, everyone stopped working and gave up all their domestic virtues. Everyone just wanted to have a good time, and soon all the riches which had cost them so little were consumed in the righteous living of debauchery. The king could not make enough gold, and when the gold ultimately lost all its value, the neediness of the people recommenced. But this time it was much more intolerable, for they remember the golden days of their prosperity, because the people had lost their sense of morals and their fear of the law. The turn of events became a general signal for robbery, murder, riot. The king who saw himself and his peoples were transported from riches to rags. He did not know what to do, but he still had not tasted all the fruit of his insane wish. His body finally succumbed to the extreme strains of his carnal pleasures. His stomach stopped digesting, he lost his strength, his sense could no longer be aroused. Illness and excruciating pain took revenge on his abused body and exposed him to all tortures of a slow annihilation in the best years of his life. Now King Mark realized that there indeed a creature more miserable than a half-dead beaten donkey, and that this most miserable of all creatures was a king who had been given the ability to make gold by some demon and had been foolish enough to accept this pernicious gift. Imagine, then, how joyful he was when in the throes of his agony he awoke and realized that everything had been a dream, and he himself was fortunately still the very same donkey had been before, as he now vividly recalled the images of his dream. He began to make some observations, and presumably no member of the human species had ever made before, and the result of these deliberations was that he became firmly convinced that it was better to remain a donkey forever than a king, without a mind and a human being without a heart. As the royal donkey was drawing his practical lessons from his dream, the sun began to rise. He got up to explore the area where he had spent the night and found that he was at the foot of a rocky hill covered by pine trees and boulders. There was a kind of hermitage with some goats climbing around it, looking for something to eat here and there between the cracks or on the flat rocks, for some grass had grown. In front of the hermitage was a narrow incline that gently sloped along the rocks of it, had made it into a vegetable garden through the hard work of some human hands that knew how to tame even the wildest regions. The same hands had planted all sorts of fruit trees on another part where they appear to thrive under the protection of a neighboring mountains, heightening the romantic appearance of the wilderness. Well, the good Mark, who was very near, but covered by some bushes, was regarding all this with a great deal of pleasure. When he saw a maiden with a large jug on her head come out of the hut in order to fetch water from a spring that was bubbling from some rocks 50 feet away. She seemed to be about 24 years old and had a slender figure. She was healthy and a good-natured creature as Mark, who was feeling his humanity again, and judge from her sprightly way of walking in the song that she hummed to herself. She was clad in a clean peasant dress without a kerchief, her hair tied in a bun, and while she walked along, she bent down to pick a fresh rose blossom and stuck it on her bosom. This afforded Mark the opportunity to make an observation that was not flattering to the bosoms that he was accustomed to seeing at court. Her skirt did not allow him to see much of her feet, but what he did see is strongly confirmed the favorable opinion he had begun to form of this exemplary daughter of guileless nature. As he was making these observations, he felt so keenly distressed once more about his present shape that he let his head and ears droop furthermore. And this is something no donkey had ever done, nor will ever do again. He started playing with the idea of throwing himself from the neighboring cliffs and into a gorge. With a heavy sigh, he moved toward the place where he might carry out his plan, when suddenly his eyes fell upon a lily that shot up out of the ground in splendor. He shied away from it, but at the same time he was seized by such a great yearning to eat the lily that he could not prevent himself no sooner. He devoured both flower and stem. Then his donkey shape miraculously vanished. He found himself transformed into a husky peasant, about 30 years of age, full of health and strength. He had everything that most mature men had, but he did not look at all like the person he had been before his first transformation. The strangest thing about it was that he had totally believed himself to be Mark King of Cornwall just a few days before, and had a clear memory of all the foolish things he had done during that period of his life. And yet he was thinking quite differently, felt his heart beating in an entirely different way, and furthermore believed with all his heart and soul that he had won something immense in this exchange. He saw it with horror about what his fate might have been if he had become King Mark once again. So vivid still was the impression of his dream on his mind that he thought that if he had to choose, he would prefer to become a donkey again rather than be a King Mark of Cornwall. With these thoughts in mind, he unexpectedly found himself once more in front of the hut where he had seen the young woman emerge with a jug on her head. He felt as if some invisible power had drawn him to the hut. He went inside and found a man old as the hills, with a hoary beard, seated in an armchair. Across from him was a shrunken older woman sitting at her spinning wheel. When he caught sight of the gray beard, he was overcome by a memory that knocked him backward a step or two. But everything else in the face of the old man suited this venerable beard and inspired a reverence and love, so that he quickly collected himself and asked the inhabitants of the solitary hut to excuse him for having entered without their permission. An accident caused me to lose my way, he said. I've been wandering about this wild region for 2 days, and was so overjoyed upon finding traces of human beings here that it would have been impossible for me to walk by without having greeted the inhabitants of the sun. Even no other reason would have driven me to do this. The two old people welcomed him in a friendly way, and since the young maiden had brought them breakfast, the meantime they invited him to sit down and eat with them. Within a short time, they became such good friends that Mark, who called himself Sylvester, felt free to offer them his services. As you can see, he said, I'm strong and hearty, you are old, and the young woman here is probably helpful and taking care of everything you need in the house, for she appears to be nimble and good-natured. Now I'd like to work, and if you hire me, I'll take over the labor that demands a man's strength. In addition, I'll treat you with the respect that I'd show my own parents. The maiden, who had been moving back and forth during the discussion and had regarded the stranger attentively when she believed that nobody was noticing, blushed when he made his offer and seemed to be delighted with it, even though she pretended that she had not been listening and continued her work. The old people accepted the young man's offer with pleasure. Sylvester, who found the necessary garden and farm tools in a shed next to the hut, installed himself in his new job on that very same day by digging up and turning the soil around the dwelling to prepare the ground for planting cabbage and carrots in one part and wheat in another. This work kept him busy for several weeks, and when he finished with it, he began to hack out a cellar in the rocks, a project to which he devoted all his time when he was not working in the garden or fields. The old couple became very fond of him and treated him as if they were their own son. He himself was happier than ever, and this way of life was so easy and familiar that it seemed to have been born and raised to do it. The food and drink had never tasted so good to him when he had been king, for he had never been hungry or thirsty. He had never slept so well, for he had never worked until he was tired. Nor had he ever laid down to rest with such contented heart, or ever arisen in such a cheerful mood as he did now to his grueling work. He had never experienced the pleasure of being useful. In short, he had never felt such joy in his existence, such peace of mind, and so much care and consideration for the people with whom he was living. Indeed, now he was a real human being. How could he have been that king, especially as foolish and as wicked king? Sylvester and the young woman who called herself Rosine had many opportunities to see each other every day. Given their situation, it would have been a mighty break in the laws of nature if their mutual feelings aren't aroused every time they had seen each other, should have led to a friendship that soon had all signs of love, though they did not exchange one word about their feelings. Their love revealed itself in so many different ways that the inclination of their hearts and minds was not a secret to either one of them. They finally expressed their feelings openly one beautiful summer evening. They encountered each other in the forest when he was busy finding some dry twigs, while she was searching for fresh leaves for her goats. At first, they worked within a large circle and got the diameter's distance between themselves, but the circle gradually became smaller without their noticing it. So it happens that they finally drew close enough to begin a friendly conversation with, without it seeming to be their intention. The heat of the day and the efforts that she made had endowed Rosine's ruddy cheeks with a lively red something else. I'm not sure what made it appear, but her breast might swell out of her bodice. Moreover, her eyes had such a sparkle to them that Sylvester could not resist stopping in front of her and regarding her with a yearning that was worthy of the best of love proposals. Rosine was a genuine daughter of nature. She did not pretend that she was not aware of his feelings, nor did it occur to her to conceal from him that she was just as moved as he was. She gave him a friendly look, blushed, lowered her eyes, and sighed. "Dear Rosine," Sylvester said, as he took her hand, but he could not utter one word more because his heart was full. "I've noticed for a long time now," Rosine said softly after a rather long pause, "that you are fond of me, Sylvester. That I am fond of Rosine? There's nothing in the world I wouldn't do for you or suffer to show you that I love you," Sylvester explained, and he pressed her hand so strongly to his heart that she could feel it pounding. "It's the same with me, too," replied Rosine, but why this spot when you don't find me repugnant, as you say?" "I don't know how I should answer you, Sylvester. I love you with all my heart. I'd rather be yours than be considered the most distinguished woman in the world, but I feel that it wouldn't work. And why wouldn't it work when we both love each other? Because there's something very strange about me, Sylvester," Rosine stuttered. "What do you mean, Rosine?" Sylvester said, letting her hand drop. "You won't believe me if I tell you." "I'll believe anything you tell me, dear Rosine. Just tell me. Only 2 days before I met you that first time I had been a rose-colored goat." "A rose-colored goat?" "Well, if it's nothing more than that, then we have nothing to reproach each other about, my dear. You see, at about that very same time I was a donkey." "A donkey," Rosine cried out, just as astonished as he had been. "How strange. But why did you become one? How did you become a human being again?" "There was a time when out of despair I wanted to take my own life, and just then a handsome youth appeared with a lily in his hand. He gave me a stone with which I was to rub myself with. He told me that this would make me happy, so I rubbed myself with the stone and turned into a donkey." "Astonishing," said Rosine. "Just as I was overcome by grief and about to tear out my hair, a marvelously beautiful lady with a crown of roses appeared before me. She gave me one of her roses and told me to stick it on my bosom. I'd be happier than I had ever been in my life. I obeyed her and was instantly changed into a rose-colored goat." "Wonderful. But how did you turn back into Rosine?" "I wandered around in the woods and mountains a whole day without knowing where I was going until I came to the hut of the old people. In this wilderness, not far from here, I noticed a large rose bush on the path of that leads to the spring. Suddenly, I felt it irresistible, urged to eat one of those roses, and no sooner I had swallowed the first petal than I became the young woman that you see before you, but now not what I had been before." "The exact same thing happened to me," Sylvester responded. "I found a lily in the woods, and I was overcome by irresistible urge to swallow it. All of a sudden, I became the young man that you see before you, but not what I had been before. There's nothing miraculous about how similar our stories are. Rosine, but what were you before you were changed into a goat?" "The most unhappy person in the world was all caused by Swindler, who managed to gain my favor through the most clever pretense, and had found a way, I don't know how, creeped into my bedroom and maked away with all my jewels." "This is becoming more and more marvelous," Sylvester exclaimed. Some other swindler did approximately the same thing to me. He made me believe that he possessed a secret that would make me the richest man in the world. But it was only his way of cheating me out of jewels worth a ton of the gold and vanished with the whole loot. But according to all this, it seems to me that we are both very distinguished people, don't you think? Maybe you won't believe me, but I was really a queen. All the better, my dearest Rosine Sylvester cried. And then you can marry me without worrying, for I was nothing less than a king. This is exceedingly strange if you're being serious, but what, Rosine? Another but? And when I would have least expected it. You can't marry me because my husband is still alive. To tell the truth, I fear that this is true in my case as well. Didn't you love your wife? She was a very beautiful woman, of course. By no means she was as beautiful as you. But what do you want? I was a king fact, not one of the best. I love change. But my wife was too monotonous for me to tender, too virtuous and too jealous. You can't imagine what a burden she was for me with all these qualities. So you are not an iota better than the king whose wife I was when I was still called Queen Mabile. What, Rosine? Your husband was King Mark of Cornwall. No one else but. And the handsome young knight who crept into your bedroom and stole your jewels wasn't his name Floribel of Nicomedes. Heavens, Rosine cried out in astonishment. How can you know all this if you aren't? Your husband himself. Sylvester interrupted her while he began hugging her at the same time. That's who I am, dear Rosine, or if you prefer, Mabile. And if you can love me just as well as I love you as Rosine, then the youth with the lily and the lady with the crown of roses have faithfully kept their word. Oh, how much I would like to be nothing but Rosine for you. But poor Sylvester, she said, weeping as she broke away from his embrace. I fear that I am not worthy of you, to be sure it happened against my will. The villain must have used magic, for I was unfortunately overcome by a supernatural sleep. It was just at that moment that I needed all my strength to keep him away from me, and I'm worried that he... You don't have to worry about this point at all, Sylvester said, laughing. Your villain was a woman in disguise, a dancer from Alexandria, who had secretly banded together with the goldmaker Miss Fragmutisirus in order to steal our jewels. When I was still a donkey, a fortunate coincidence brought me to the cave to which they had fled with their booty, and I heard everything from their own lips. If this is true, Rosine said that she flung herself into the arms, then I'm the happiest creature in the world just as long as you remain Sylvester. And I am the happiest of men just as long as you never stop being Rosine. Are you really so happy? They heard two familiar voices asked. When they turned around, they were startled to see standing before them the old man with the hoary beard and the good old woman. Sylvester wanted to find something to say, but before he could open his mouth, the old man turned into the youth with the lily, and the old woman became the lady with the crown of roses. You are seeing again those who took it upon themselves to make you happy, the handsome young man said, at a time when you both considered yourselves the unhappiest creatures in the world. You are seeing us for the last time. You still have one more chance to become what you were before your transformation, or to remain Sylvester and Rosine. But you must choose now. Let us stay the way we are. They cried out at the same time as they prostrated themselves before the two divine beings may have him protect us from any other wish. So you see, we've kept our word, the lady said. Then you found the philosopher's stone in the wilderness. With these words, the two spirits disappeared in Sylvester, and Rosine hurried back to their hut arm and arm under the lovely glow of the moon.